Hello, and welcome to the Game Dev Local podcast. I'm your host, Nina Kim, and today we're going to be talking to the wonderful Hana Noelle. Hana is a 2D and 3D artist who has worked at Us2 Games, Half Past Yellow, and Cyvo Games. Thank you so much for joining us, Hana. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, Nina. It's really lovely to be here. Happy to chat.
That's so good to hear. So, I just want to ask you some starter questions to let the listeners get to know you a little better. How did you start in the industry, and what made you realize that game art was for you?
Yeah, my professional journey, I guess, career, whatever, started at my studies or with my studies. I studied at DigiPen Institute of Technology, which is a uh, fairly well regarded or well known institute just outside of Seattle, Washington, in America, that's specifically designed for the video game industry. So they have degree programs for every aspect of making a game, and I did the digital art and animation track with them. And I knew I wanted to make games just because I was always a nerd and I was always a gamer, and I think I was a very creative kid, and I drew all the time. I knew I wanted to make art as well. And as someone who was a nerdy, not necessarily introverted, but a kid that was more interested in the online world and the digital world than the people that I went to school with, I just really resonated with the worlds that video games can build. So that's what led me to DigiPen. And from DigiPen, I got a job at Cybo Games right as I was graduating. So I moved first from New Jersey, where I'm from, to Seattle, which is already like a 6 hour plane, to Seattle to Denmark in Copenhagen. And I
Wow.
was I was at Cybo for a while. That was the beginning of my career, mostly making Subway Surfers. So yeah.
That's great. That's so fun. I'm actually from Seattle, so it's
Oh
it's fun.
really?
It's nice to
Cool.
hear that. Yeah. So you are a Palestinian American
Yeah.
who's now living in the UK. You've gotten to see the industry across the world and experience what it's like to work in different countries. So how does your migrant experience shape your sense of security or risk when it comes to choosing projects or studios?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that I have become even more acutely aware of as time has gone on. I think, especially in the beginning of my career, I was quite lucky. I got my job pretty early out the gate from school, as I said. And I think when you're young, I think I was 20 or just turned 21 when I moved to Copenhagen. You can also be quite naive and bright eyed about things. And I started to realize later on in my time in Denmark, when I was thinking about maybe I want to leave, I became really aware of, oh, I can't just leave. I'm not like other people here where, my colleagues, if they decide this studio isn't for me or this country isn't for me, they can just move somewhere else in Europe or they can move to another studio really easily. I had to think, oh, if I leave this studio, I either have to find another visa or another country that will grant me a visa, or I have to go back to America. And uh, America at that point was also politically changing a lot. And, I know it's not a politics podcast, so we won't go into that, but it was just not really a place that I wanted to be in. So, yeah, I started to become a lot more aware of the power dynamics of being a migrant worker, and that there is so much more to think about. Um, yeah, and so in terms of future and how that relates to how I think about studios now, I think one of the hard things is, especially now in this immediate moment more than ever, it means that I have to be a bit less like choosy in some ways. I can't. Not every studio can is even eligible to hire me for a work visa, even if they really like me. That's actually there's a studio I've been talking to lately that's, we have a great relationship. I really like them, but they're like, we're just not eligible for sponsoring visas. And as well, I think it's just, it's an added expense for studios. And so you have to be not just someone who might be a good hire, but you have to be someone who is a good hire and also worth the added expenses. So there's a lot that goes into it. And it's definitely a way higher risk. I think that the risks for migrant workers are so much more than most people see, and that is really visible. And not to waffle on too long, but as well, there's so much around. The thing is, if I lose my job, that means that not only do I have the insecurity of no longer having that job, but it also means that I may not have my whole life, and I've got, all migrant workers have a life that they have built in the place that they've moved to, and where they live. They have friends, they may have family. So there's just a lot more at stake.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I'm here on a work visa and I
Yeah.
had my child here. She was born here, but
Yes.
if that gets cut off, and they don't really give you much time either to find
No,
a new, yeah.
not at all. It's once in the UK, at least, if you lose your visa or you lose your job, then whenever the government informs you that you've lost your job, you have 60 days to either get a new visa or leave the country. And that's so true, is, as you said, you've had a child here, and I think a lot of people would assume, oh, but you've had a kid here, so you must get extra privileges or you must get whatever. But there's no there are no graces granted, even for the children of migrant workers who are born in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about something
Yeah.
less. Um, how has working with different cultures felt different on different teams, or how does it reflect in your work?
Yeah, definitely. I think Copenhagen was a huge adjustment for me. Also, the team that I was on was fairly international. I think in Europe, a lot of teams are more international than they would be in America, because there's obviously, you've just got people from all different European countries. And culturally, Denmark on the whole was just a very big shift from America. People are much more insular in some ways. They're a lot less open, and like chatty with strangers as they are in America. And, you know, I think the interesting thing about working at Saibo, for example, where, as I said, we had people from all different European countries, is you see, oh, okay, there's tendencies for how like Germans might communicate versus Italians, versus we also had people from Brazil or Portugal. And there's so many different communication styles. And you learn when you work on a diverse team that one of the greatest skills in your toolbox is not trying to force people to understand what you mean because they come from a different culture, but to understand how other people need to be communicated with so that you can bridge that gap of understanding. And it's really valuable, but also really difficult in the beginning. I think Americans are often read as abrasive or direct or loud, or maybe they're steamrolling. And especially Americans from the East Coast, our communication style, we tend to, one of the biggest differences is we talk along. So we don't consider it interrupting. But if you're saying something and I'm like in agreement with it, I might say, yeah, yeah, oh, that happened to me as well, while you're speaking, and not expect you to stop talking. But in Denmark, I would talk along and people would just stop mid sentence because I started speaking, and it was mortifying. I was like, no, I didn't mean to stop you. This is just like really different communication styles. But it was also really, yeah, it was a very, very valuable thing. And especially the work that I was doing there, which maybe we'll get into more later, working with subway surfers, was about creating characters that represented cultures from all over the world. So yeah, what was the initial question again? It was just about how it is to work with different cultures. Well, that's one way of explaining it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great to hear about because so much of game development is kind of communication with your team, and
Yeah,
everyone has a different preference, and it's so funny because oftentimes in education it's not really taught. It's like
yeah.
soft skills. It's like, oh, like people give feedback in different ways, and they talk in different ways, and maybe they process information in different ways. So it's
Completely. And the way that people not only communicate, but the way that they view the world is completely shaped by their cultural upbringing and their understanding. And I think that it's also a particularly valuable skill in video games and in video game development, because we are creating something that is meant to communicate to a huge range of people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, culturally, socioeconomically, and so I think that it's a huge skill to know how to communicate what you want to say in ways that will be understood and recognized by people globally. And that can become really limiting if you are working in a space where everybody is very much monocultural in one way or another. Um, so I'm grateful for the experience of working with like all different cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. I always thought, well, I was in Seattle, we're quite diverse, but moving to the UK, I realized I was like, oh no, there's so many
Yeah,
cultures and there's so many things you can gain by just moving and living in that culture. And the way that the industry kind of runs in different areas,
yeah,
different parts of the world. Um, I wanted to go back to the topic of visas
yes.
because I know like I've experienced something surrounding that, but um, do you feel like you can be fully honest in your role, or has there ever been times where you feel trapped or hesitant to speak due to your visa status?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because I'm a very honest person generally. I'm very straightforward, and I think there's a lot of my own personal values are around transparency, honesty, and again, I think there are some elements. I don't want to necessarily say that I've been naive when I was younger, because it's not really that. I think it's just it's easy to forget sometimes that when you're making video games, because it's such a cool industry, and a lot of the time the people you're working with are very cool and hip, and some, especially like mid-sized studios or bigger size that like give themselves a more indie vibe, they can feel really it can feel like, oh, we're all friends here and we all have good values. So it's easy to forget that this is still a corporate environment, and that sometimes you think that we're all human first and we're all speaking the same language, but there's actually all these different layers of corporate interest and stakeholders and yada yada yada, that a lot of the time is shielded from the main like worker class by the higher levels of the hierarchies. But anyway, and that can be, that can be said in relation to a lot of different modes of being transparent. But when it comes to visa stuff, definitely you're more at risk. So I've always been a very honest and upfront person, and I've never really been afraid of speaking my mind in work environments. And I think that, in I think that I've mostly been appreciated for that, and even when there has been challenges, I think that they've been handled well. However, I I have felt, especially in times when I've been a bit more uncertain about my visa situation or about what I'm going to be doing next, felt like I had to be a lot more tactful about things, or at least it would be suggested to me like, hey, maybe you should be a little bit more careful. And I find that so difficult because I think for myself, my conviction and my like integrity is so dependent as well on my ability to speak openly and freely. But you have to think, if you do make things difficult for people, and they find a reason to get you out of the way, your situation is so much more vulnerable, as we said before. So yeah, I do think that in some ways I have shifted, or at least not even really shifted, but I've been thinking a lot more about how I how and when it makes more sense to speak freely. I'm trying to speak a little bit vaguely to try and not talk about specific situations too much, but yeah. Does that make sense though
Yeah,
what I'm saying? I think like you know, but that being said, if anybody asked me, do you think that I shouldn't speak my mind because I'm on a visa? I would never want to suggest that to somebody, because I also think that it's a personal choice that you have to make, but I think that honesty and integrity might not be rewarded in the immediate, but I think in the long term, those are things that um, that will that will grant you more in life. And I'm not even really talking about more rewards financially or job wise, although it will, because if you are a person who is honest and you have integrity, the right people will remember that and will help you and support you later in life. But in the immediate, sometimes you will get punished for that honesty. And that's not to scare people, that's to say that if and when it does happen, don't question yourself, I would say. Um,
yeah,
yeah.
I totally agree. I'm all about honesty, and in my experience, it's always been a good thing. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, there's ways about it, like phrasing. There's ways of being honest and phrasing it in a way that it's not, um, kind of inflaming a situation or anything like that. But
Yeah.
I've definitely felt like if I have something that I truly believe or some issue, I like to bring it up and
Yeah.
actually be honest with the people involved, because it's going to come out one way or another, like the way you act,
Absolutely.
the way you talk, like. And so and it's to their benefit too. It's not like you're trying to hurt them with this information. It's all for the better. So it's definitely great, but I've definitely seen people who hesitate because they're tied to a visa. It's like, well, I wouldn't do that because what about like
Yeah.
my probation period, and what about my visa, and what about this? And so it's a bit tricky.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, like then the studio is like, oh, well, we see no problems with this because no one brings it up, and so it's like,
Well,
well,
yeah, and that's
like
the issue, and
silence. Yeah.
that's how problems maintain, and not just problems, but like particularly for people who are suffering or struggling with things. That's how those things maintain, is when nobody brings them up. And even if you do bring them up, things might not happen, but you'll at least know I've done what I can, and this is now, it's out of my hands in some ways, but I've at
Mm.
least like lived by my own integrity and been honest about it. I will say, because in my career I've gone from being, like a junior artist to a lead, that when you transition into the lead role, I have been, told by people who were leads longer than me that it becomes a lot more nuanced in terms of how honest, and the ways that you're honest when you're a lead, where there's like things about withholding some information or being very careful about how you communicate things. And that was a really big adjustment for me, and not one that I ever think I haven't fully figured out. Because a part of that, like a piece of advice that I had gotten was, if you're struggling with a thing, you can be honest about struggling with it and ask for help, but you shouldn't frame it in a way that seems like you're insecure about it, or that you have to always show this confidence and ask for help, but in a way where you don't let other people think that you might be incompetent. And I was like, this is completely new to me, because if I'm struggling, I want to be completely open about my struggles. And if I'm feeling a bit insecure about a thing, I want to be like, I'm feeling insecure about this thing. It's going to be okay, and I'm working through it. But I've always received good feedback that being open about even your insecurities allows other people to know that their own insecurities, especially as a lead, I think, Like, if you're a lead and you say, I'm struggling with insecurity, I would feel if my lead said that, oh, my lead also struggles with that, and I struggle with that. We can all take a breath and relax, but not everybody sees it that
I
way.
think you're a very empathetic person, but there are definitely people who see that and they're like, "Oh, they're weak. They shouldn't be a
Yes.
lead,"
Yeah.
which was news to me too. It takes me like a lot of adjusting because I am a very open person and I
Yeah.
just want to tell everyone like what's going on, how exactly I feel. I don't want to water it down or
Yeah.
anything. And definitely I learned that in some cases that can either have certain people take that the wrong way or may dampen their spirits because you're being too honest about
Yeah.
how certain things are going.
Yeah.
Um, and it is sort of like as a lead, you're like, oh, you want to uplift people and you want to make sure that they feel like it's okay. And in some ways, it's kind of like parenting. It's weird. I
Yeah.
don't know. Like it's sort of like like sometimes withholding isn't completely withholding. It's just maybe phrasing it in a way where they can, uh, take that information without taking damage.
Yes. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
very nuanced and delicate balance, especially for a neurodiverse person as well, because I, I've got ADHD, and like a very intense ADHD, and maybe other things, who knows, but uh I think it gets even more complicated when you are a neurodiverse person, um for a million reasons. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, is there anything you think studios could do better to support international workers beyond sponsoring them? Like even when it comes to these situations where they may not feel like they can speak up, it might be a cultural thing or just processes or support that they could give.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the spot, I think that one of the biggest things is to be open about having honest conversations about it. So I think that one of the hard parts, and one of the hardest parts for me, is that inequality, and like in a way, I will say that it is an inequality, like that there are, you know, the experience for a migrant worker versus someone who has residency in the country that they're working is one of very like differing degrees of like vulnerability, of risk, etc. And I think that most of the time, people who are on visas will be given the visa, but then otherwise treated, and spoken to and have the exact same experience as someone who is a resident. And that's completely fine. However, I think that even just having intentional conversations where you say, once every couple months, or even just when you first are hired, that says, also, you're a migrant worker, so I want to acknowledge that you're more at risk. And as a result of that, let's make sure that we both understand what those risks are, and can maybe together we can make a plan to mitigate those risks. I think even that alone, just having the vulnerability acknowledged, would make a huge difference, because as well, especially for younger people who are on visas, who maybe were like me, where I was kind of naive to it in the beginning, that might also allow me to recognize my own vulnerability. I think one of the worst things is if you don't even realize that you're vulnerable until the thing has happened to you. When you're just kind of going along living your life, and then all of a sudden the rug is pulled out from under you, and you're like, I haven't been able to prepare for this. I didn't even realize this was a possibility. I have no idea what to do now. So a workplace could say, when you get hired as a migrant, let's have a conversation. We'll have like a 30-minute chat with an immigration lawyer who can, tell you all of the risks, all of the things to mitigate it. What happens if suddenly either you lose your job or you decide you no longer want to work with us, or whatever. Um, just to get a better sense of like awareness, and to create that plan, I think that alone would do like so much and would be really low cost for a studio.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Even like with my experiences with visas, it's like
Yeah,
once I got it, I didn't even know everything that was surrounding it. I didn't know all the details.
yeah,
I was just like, "Oh, I have a visa. That's great." But it's like, what happens when you don't? Like, how much time
yeah,
do you have?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, I also wanted to talk to you because I think you brought it up a little bit. I wanted to talk to you a bit about your experience being a queer neurodivergent woman in an
yeah,
industry that's still quite male dominated.
yeah,
So, first, I'd love to dive into how you found out about your neurodivergence, especially since this is
yeah.
something that can be harder to identify in women.
Yeah, what's really funny is I've always been, if you know what textbook ADHD, especially in women, can look like, I've always been textbook ADHD. When I was a kid, I mean, I recently was I when I was visiting my grandmother's house, I found a box that had a bunch of my report cards from when I was a kid, and every single report card said really bright, but just doesn't hand in homework. Really bright, but just needs to apply herself, or never pays attention in class, or whatever. So all of the signs have always been there. But I never thought of myself as someone with ADHD because, for one, I obviously, whatever was going on in my head was normal to me. But also, so much of what you, especially when I was growing up, so much of what you imagine and what media would tell you and what most people thought was that you were bouncing off the walls, really like, fidgety and very physically active. And pretty much what you mostly see in young boys. Um, but yeah, I have an inattentive kind of ADHD. Um, and the way that I found out was when I was when I was at DigiPen. I thought, everybody's using study drugs like Adderall and things like that. I'm gonna go and pretend that I have ADHD and try and get a prescription so that I can get these study drugs. And so of course I went into, like, met up with the psychiatrist and had like an initial consultation about it, and she was like, do you have any of these symptoms? And I was like, oh shit, I do. And so yeah, I found out that I had ADHD through trying to scam my doctor into getting me Adderall. Turned out I needed it for real. So that's how I found out about it. And beyond that, I think the longer that I lived with it and knew that I had it, the more that I could learn about it, and the more that I was able to be like, oh, is this not things that everybody's struggling with and just learning to mask? Because I also think that masking, this is a thing with, not just with ADHD, but also autism, especially also autistic women and girls. We learn to mask so much more than boys tend to, because of all of the expectations put on us from a young age. And this, that's just how it goes. So yeah, as I learned more about it, I became more and more vocal about the ways that it impacts me. Um, but to answer your question about how I found out, that's how.
It's a really funny way to find out.
Yeah,
I just recently found out that I have ADHD and autism, and
yeah,
I didn't realize it was just because my friends were talking about it, and I was like, "Oh, haha, I have some of those symptoms." And then it
yeah.
was like,
Like,
"Oh,
oh, okay,
maybe
that
I am."
sounds familiar.
Yeah, it was funny because it was like first I was like, "Oh, well, I probably have ADHD," and then I looked into it, I was like, "Great," and then someone else was like, "I actually think you're autistic," and I was like, "No," and it was like, but it's sort of like I thought it was all just like Korean culture or like
Yeah,
I'm just a
yeah,
weirdo.
yeah,
um, and because like a lot of like people who are artistic have a hard time identifying like other or like understanding other people's emotions, and I'm really good at understanding emotions, but
yeah.
my assessor was telling me that uh women often mask or they find ways to identify patterns, and I was like, oh, I
Yes.
am definitely identifying patterns. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, it's so funny how you can adjust and then not know that you have it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you think, oh, people with autism, they don't understand people's emotions. And in your mind, you're like, the version of understanding emotions that makes sense to you, you're like, well, yeah, I do understand emotions because I've created this entire structure in order to survive that allows me to identify people's emotions. And because and so I can apply that structure and think, well, yeah, what's the difference between that and understanding emotions? It all becomes very fuzzy and gooey when it's about our own experiences versus the way other people describe a personal experience. You know,
Absolutely. Yeah, when I heard of it, when I finally realized, it kind of changed the way I thought about work as well. Because the way I work,
yeah,
like there's different things that occur, and I'm like, oh, there's ways to like make this better because other people are experiencing the same thing. So my question to you is, what are some ways that your neurodivergence affects the way you work, and have
yeah.
you found ideal ways to work in a way that works for you?
Yeah, definitely my ADHD means that I don't work in the way that, um, the typical standard way that was set by mostly neurotypical men. I mean, most work culture in general and like school culture, etc. The standard was set by metrics set by like neurotypical men. Even, I mean, this is like a side thing, but even the temperature of offices tends to be too cold for women, because women tend to have like a slightly different body temperature, and like the normal temperature for offices is like, men tend to run a bit warmer. It's a whole thing. But anyway, so for myself, I cannot sit down for however many hours in front of the computer and just work. I just can't do it. If I try and do it, I will go crazy. So uh, I take a lot of breaks. I get up and walk around if I feel the urge. I think one of the biggest barriers for me, has been around guilt. So as I realized that I was neurodivergent, I was like, oh, I have to work in slightly different ways. I have to take more breaks. But then I would take more breaks, and then I would start to feel the guilt from taking breaks because I was like, well, everybody else is just sat at their desk all day. And I have to get up and walk around constantly. Does everybody else think that I'm slacking? Do people think this and that? And then all of a sudden, I was taking breaks and I was spiraling in my head about the guilt for taking breaks, which wasn't helping my productivity either. Um, so I think, one of the best things that you can do when it comes to learning how to work with your neurodiversity is to first work on the feelings of shame or guilt that you have, relating to your neurodiversity. Because that is one of the biggest barriers, I think, even more so than external things, to allowing us to just thrive in our own workspaces, which is one of the reasons I actually think working from home for many neurodiverse people has been great. Because when I'm home, I don't feel guilty about taking breaks. Even with all the work that I've done on not feeling guilty, I still feel it sometimes, especially in the office. I still feel guilty when I'm getting up and walking around. Um, so yeah, being able to work from home, being able to take breaks, and then largely learning from other people. Um, so I discovered Dr. K, Healthy Gamer, at one point, and I'm a big advocate of his. I don't know. Are you familiar?
I'm
Um,
not. I'm gonna have
Okay,
to
so
look.
this is really cool. It's kind of geared towards younger people, but I think even for anybody, it's really valuable. I discovered him a while ago. I think his YouTube is Healthy Gamer GG. I'm not paid by him, but he was a Harvard psychiatrist, who was also a gamer and recognized that there was a gap in the market for, people with, gaming addiction, or not market, but like a gap in, support for people with gaming addiction, and started this online resource that has grown into a whole really beautiful thing where I found him from how he used to, or I guess still does, Twitch stream entire therapy sessions with people. So he'll do a
Oh,
Twitch
wow.
stream with someone with ADHD, or we'll Twitch stream a session with like a convicted felon. And one of the other things about therapy is like, you know, a lot of us actually are not that unique. Many of us are struggling with the same things. And we also all can't access therapy. But if you watch a therapy session with someone who struggles with similar things to you can actually gain so much for yourself from watching that. So he would do that, and he also does short videos, and he's got these like modules for coping with ADHD, anxiety, depression. There might be others now, but he also like incorporates a lot of it with mindfulness. He was also a monk in India. So anyway, I think like understanding myself, incorporating mindfulness into my practices, watching his videos helped me a lot. I'm waffling on a little bit, but
That's great. I mean, I learned something. I'm definitely gonna look him up, but
yeah,
it's that sounds great. It's kind of funny because I kind of think that everyone should have therapy and breaks, frequent breaks.
yeah,
It's weird that our culture is like sit at a desk for like the whole day and don't
yeah,
move. It's
yeah,
healthier to walk and take breaks, and especially in creative industry, I think we have some things to iron out when it comes to creative industries because being creative works differently than like just pure like business. So it's sort of
yeah.
like we're butting up against like how to be creative but also make money, and like some of this is like causing the creativity to like kind of stagnate and like
Oh,
not like too well. So it's like
absolutely.
sometimes when you're taking a walk you get inspired and you get more creative and then your product is better.
Yeah, I think with creative work in particular, it's not just like filling out a spreadsheet or doing a really practice. It's like, you know how there are some tasks that you can listen to music to while doing and some tasks that you can't because they use different parts of your brain and have different kinds of processing. There's also some jobs that you can do and be thinking about completely different things, or it's just like a physical task almost that you just literally do. I think creative work is so difficult because you can't just do it. Like there's these problems to solve and creative ideas that you have to come up with, and if your head is not in a good place or in the right place in the right state of mind, you literally just can't do the work. So this is something as well. I could probably go on forever if I get too into it, but I had a really difficult year that has impacted me in a big way. But this past year was extremely difficult um, for me emotionally. And during that year, there was a lot of moments when I realized, like, no matter what I might do, I will not be able to do this work. No matter how hard I try, I just like literally physically cannot do it because my brain is at zero. So it's kind of like, and it was really difficult because I started to get into my head because there was a lot of new things in this role as well that I was just incompetent. Like I just couldn't do the thing. But it was more like if you have a perfectly functioning vehicle, like a car that has all of the right pieces and it can go and it can do it really well, but there's just no gas in the tank. It doesn't matter how competent that vehicle is, doesn't matter how good it is, it's just not going to go anywhere if there's no gas in the tank. So, having breaks, being aware of your mental health, being aware of how much capacity you have. And the other thing to remember if you're neurodivergent, especially so for myself with ADHD, people with ADHD struggle a lot with executive function, and we have a limited capacity of it. And that, of course, executive function is just our ability to make decisions and like recall certain things and all the kind of doing. That stuff is so much harder for people with ADHD than for neurotypical people. Um, so when we already have so little in the tank, those things become actually impossible. Like there was times where if you asked me what I wanted for dinner, I would start crying because I literally couldn't call something to mind, and the thought of having to make that choice would make me crumble.
Yeah. I'm sorry your husband or your I'm so sorry. It's been so hard.
But you know
Um
what? Thank you. But also, what I just keep saying is, and this has gotten me through a lot, is this is all the start of a great TED talk. Because every good TED talk starts with someone talking about the worst period of their life. So that has put me through a lot, is to remember that, you know, these times are hard, but they build character, and you gain, as long as you can get through it, you often gain a lot from those hard times. Not to diminish how hard the times are, but it's important to remember that there's more than that, just that moment.
Yeah, and it's also not like the end of the line, right? Like there's always
Yeah.
like you can always get through it if you stick to it. Like I've had a lot of bad spots previously, and like looking back I'm like, "Oh, it's behind me." Like and
Yeah.
things have gotten better, and you know how to like handle it um if it
Mm.
anything else like that occurs. So but still, I hope everything gets better.
Yeah. Yeah. It
um,
will. It will. Otherwise, it's not over. Yeah.
yeah. um, I know that you have a passion in DEI support for the marginalized. I'd love to
Yeah.
hear about how a marginalized team member might be affected in unseen ways.
Yeah. And there's actually a lot of ways, and I think that this is a really important uh, important thing to talk about, because, you know, so yeah, for example, having a marginalized person on a team, they tend to do a lot more work than others. For example, most masking or code switching, or like kind of managing other people's fragility around the ways that, like, you know, when people communicate with marginalized people, um, sometimes this just like this very strange kind of communication that goes on, that ends up with the marginalized person having to be like, no worries, it's okay, I can handle this situation, or it's okay, we can have this conversation and I will make sure I'm okay. um uh there's also elements of like, I mean, it's basically unpaid DEI work where they act as like cultural translators, essentially. um Yeah, and as well, I think one of the other big things that we forget about is that marginalized people have had to, almost definitely have had to overcome so much in order to just be there in the first place. Um, and I think that that work and effort goes unrecognized. And as well, I think that the wounds that can be left also go unrecognized and unspoken about. It's sort of, in another way, similar to how a migrant worker will, you'll never talk about the fact that they're a migrant and that they're more vulnerable. And I think that it's sort of the same when it comes to marginalized people on teams sometimes, where, you know, there'll be this like, yay, you're diverse, you know, and we've done the diversity and we're so glad you're here, and now we're going to do the equality thing and like treat you the same as everybody else, without actually acknowledging that you have had to do so much more in order to be here, or you've had to endure more, or you've had to deal with more ignorance in order to be here. So I think that you know, it's that difference between equality and equity, and um, how much more work marginalized people have to do that never really gets acknowledged or paid or recognized. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I can relate to that. But
Yeah.
there's so many things that are unseen, like even being a woman or like
Yeah.
being like non-white,
Yeah.
that like I actually didn't realize was happening because
Yeah.
sometimes you're just like, oh, I'm being judged in a different way, but I didn't know that's because I'm a woman or because
Yeah.
I'm a certain way. So it's crazy, and those things just pop up, and you're like, oh, I guess that's still a thing.
Absolutely, it does, and as well, people don't even really realize that they're doing it because it's so ingrained in our structures, and it's so like systemic, you know, and integrated into the workplace cultures and to everything. I mean, and I've literally had that thing where I once had, there was some male colleagues at my first job who were having a conversation about something, and I had that moment when you walk up to the walk up to them, and then you can tell they just stop talking about something, or they just shift what they're saying. And one of them was a friend of mine, and I could tell he was, he thought the conversation. I could tell that he was like, I want to expose this guy for the conversation that he was trying to have with me. So he said, "Oh, do you want to tell Hannah a bit about what you were just telling me?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, I was thinking about wouldn't it be cool if someone made like a fashion game that was like this or that?" And my friend told me afterwards that what he was actually saying was, "What if we made a game with these, like, where you had these like sexy cat girls with like big breasts, and they did all this and that," and I was just saying like really misogynistic things, um, but won't go and have that conversation with me for obvious reasons, because he knows what he's doing. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and as well, and that comes up
Um,
in other ways with being queer, with being, I think what the other thing is, like, being white passing is really a weird thing. Like, I think people often don't recognize that I'm Arab, uh, right away. And a lot of people will think, oh, I'm talking to another white person. So then I can talk about things that I wouldn't say in front of like a brown person or a black person. And that's always very strange when you're like, oh, okay. So this is, it's sort of the other side of that. Oh, you had that conversation with my friend because he was a man, but you won't let me see that?
Yeah, it's so strange. And some people don't even know they're doing it. I had some friends that were talking about characters that they wanted to put in their game, and they're like, "Okay, we'll have these female characters, and this is what females want." And I'm like, "I don't want that. Like,
Yeah.
why can't you have like?" I gave them a description of a character I would want, and they're like, "That's well, who would want that?" I'm like, "I would want that."
I am a
uh,
woman in front of you saying that's what I would want. I even have
so
you know, my
strange.
my girlfriend my girlfriend was playing, she really loves skateboard simulators. And she was playing one, I don't remember what it's called, but she there's two that she plays, and in one of them she has a character that she's made look more like her. And then in this one she was playing it, and I was like, "Who's this guy?" Because she was playing as like a really generic white dude, and she was like, "Oh yeah, well, it's just that their female characters just look horrible and have no options. So I end up playing with this guy because, like, first of all, they've only got 3 skin tones and none of them are mine. And like the female characters, even though they obviously use the exact same rig and even the same like body, they just made the arms skinnier. She can only wear a certain pair of skinny jeans, and she's like, I want to wear baggy shorts, or I want to wear all these other things, and all the options are for the male character because they don't think that women are even playing a skateboarding game to begin with, you know?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's so weird because I'll bring up characters that I do think are done well, and I'm like, oh, hey, they have someone that like I can relate to, and some of my friends are like, yeah, whatever, like, why? It's a big deal, or they're like, oh, you're one of those people who like just
Yeah, there's
want.
very much that as well, where they're like, oh, so you're going to be one of the people that make a big deal about this thing that we're not affected by, so we don't realize how much it actually impacts people, you
Yeah,
know?
it's just like, no, I'm just happy that like there's a character like me.
Yeah.
Like
And
it's just
why is that?
simply
And
that.
that's so hard to understand, I think, for especially for white men, because their tastes have been tailored to forever. So they have no idea what it feels like to not be represented, you know?
Yeah, I actually didn't realize how much it affected me because when, like, for a while, it's like, yeah, whatever, I'll play any character. I like superheroes. Like, it's fine if they're all
Yeah.
men, whatever. But, like, the more I see how my daughter reacts to things. She's even
Yeah.
like representation of women. She's like, oh, well, all the women wear dresses and they are blonde. Like all the princesses are blonde, and
Yeah.
any princess that isn't blonde doesn't have a nice, pretty dress. So therefore, I want to be blonde. And I'm like, oh, but you're beautiful. Why? I mean, I have
Yeah.
nothing against blondes, but like, you should love yourself. And if like things like this are affecting
Yeah.
my child, like, I want more representation.
Especially for non-white children, where I mean that's such a big thing, like, of, oh well, my hair isn't right, my I don't have fair, thin, or straight, rather, blonde hair, I don't have those Eurocentric beauty standards that are the only thing that I ever see represented. And that came a lot into play when I was the character artist on Subway Surfers,
Oh
which I don't
yeah.
know if you want to talk about that, but
I definitely wanted to talk about that. So,
yeah.
so how did you go about designing these characters? And I know that there was a lot of influence of like wanting diversity within that.
Yeah. So the way that it worked, and I think still works with Subway Surfers, as a live game that's been around for over a decade now, um, they have seasons where they go to a different city around the world, and they often release a new character for that city. And they'll usually have a character that is in some way representative of the city. And I think that before I came on, well, I mean, they there was some diversity. I don't want to like disparage the team that was before me, but I mean, I think mostly it was other Danish people, and their perspectives are just inherently like limited because of their experiences, and that's not at all a problem with them. That's just like that's how it is. And so when I came on, especially as someone who is alternative, different, comes from another country, also has a different cultural background, it was important to me that whenever I was creating characters, that I really tried to not only look at a little bit of, oh, what's this place from, or what's the first thing that comes to mind when I imagine what someone from this place would be like, or what would a representation be, but I would try and dig a little deeper. And my thing, and maybe this again is me representing myself, but because I am very much invested in different subcultures, I always wanted the characters that I made I would always look into a subculture, because I also think that when you research subcultures, you often get a much more like honest and raw picture of a broader culture. Because like I think that mainstream culture can become quite homogenized, and especially nowadays with like everything being so global. And I actually think a culture's counterculture can be more representative of what's at the core of the culture, because it's responding to like directly to what's happening. So yeah, so I would often look into the countercultures of that city or whatever it might be. And it was really cool. It was really cool for me as well to be like, what's missing here? And even representing things that I had no connection to. Um, so I, for example, brought in the I designed the first character with a prosthetic limb in Subway Surfers, who is Zane, which was also another thing about Zane is he it was this was for the Berlin update, and Berlin is also a place that has a lot of cultural diversity as well, a lot of children of refugees, of migrants. And so Zane was a Syrian boy with a prosthetic limb that and at that point we had very limited characters that were not like white or black or generically like East Asian, and but was something that was a bit more specific. So that was really nice for me. And then I think one of the coolest things about working on a live game is in real time you can receive feedback as soon as it goes live, which would be like a month after I created the character. I would see people being like, "Oh, this is really cool. Oh, I have a prosthetic limb. It's really nice to see this." And I also had that with I made Alba, who was the first character that had a bigger body type, because I was always a really, I mean, I'm not that big these days, but I was a very chubby kid when I was a kid, like very chubby, and that was completely fine, obviously, but I didn't feel like it was fine because everything around me was showing me really thin characters. And especially for women, you'll see male characters of all varying body types and shapes and etc. Not that there aren't toxic standards for men in media either, but for women, you are either thin and desired, or you were fat and not desired, or you were the butt of a joke. And so yeah, so I brought in the first character with a larger body type. I also have a character that there's a video of me talking about on YouTube called Callum, who is for the Edinburgh update, who's like a little Scottish punk, and who's like very much representative of my own subcultures with like punk music and etc. But also the character is I was designed to be like a non-binary he they character, and some people picked up on that in the video of me speaking about them, and the comments were just so lovely to see. And the other things people picked up is that Callum is wearing yellow ladder laces, which is, in like punk subculture, is a symbol of anti-racism. And like I never said anything about it in the video, but in the comments people were picking up on it, and it's just like really really cool to see that engagement and how people resonate with like the characters that you can make. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that is so great when you talk about subcultures and all the details that you consider. Like, I was going to ask you about like how you approach diversity without slipping into tokenism and stereotypes, but it kind
Yeah.
of feels like you covered it there. It's sort of like because oftentimes when I look for representation, like some some games try to do it with good intentions and they're like, look, we have an Asian person, but like it's not quite like that person is just an Asian person and doesn't have like an actual character. It's
Yeah.
like, oh well,
Yeah.
and so it's nice to hear all the considerations you have, and it's like, no, this person is a person. They like these things. They stand for these things, and I'm not telling you. It's just reflected in uh, how they're
Exactly. Well,
represented.
like I think it's just about honestly creating a character. I think
Yeah,
that it inevitably will not be tokenization if you just genuinely make a character. You know, it's like
absolutely.
yeah, this like when I made those characters, I didn't think like, oh, I'm going to do this because this is a thing that we need to do to fill the quota. It was like when I worked with the character for Berlin, it was, oh, I need to make a character for Berlin. Let me think about like, and I was looking up what percentages of like migrant people, like how many migrant refugees or how many people come from different cultures. And I was also, yeah, partly, I was like, we don't have a character with a prosthetic limb. Why? Not because we should have one to fill a quota, but I was like, because it's important to me to feel recognized and seen in the games that I play. I was like, well, what? Absolutely, we should have a character with a prosthetic limb. And like, the thing I'm going to get excited about isn't that I'm filling this quota, but then I was like, oh, and like, what else does that mean about their character? What are the things that they're going to care about because of this, and this? How would they style? Like, I have a friend who also has a prosthetic leg, and I know a big part of it for her is she's like, yeah, I have like different legs for different outfits, and I style things in this way, and sometimes like I would rather be in the wheelchair because like whatever. Um, and I think just like being curious and learning about something, and making it about the character, not about hitting these tick boxes, it just naturally happens that you end up not being tokenizing.
Absolutely. When I think about it, I usually think about it as like this person is my friend. Who are they?
Yeah, yeah,
When I think about
absolutely.
characters, because they like you're like, oh, who would I be friends with? Like, what is this? Who is this person? Like, they
Yeah,
have a prosthetic limb. Like, how do they feel? What
yeah,
are their hobbies? What do they like? And it's really great to hear about all the thoughts you have behind your process. So
yeah,
it's a pleasure to hear about that.
yeah. Thank you.
Um, you also mentioned to me before about the topic of creating safe spaces and games for the queer and kink positive. Could you tell
Yeah.
me a little more about that? Like how these spaces can be created and what considerations are made in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my other passion is around like sex education. So when I was at DigiPen, for example, I started the Sexual Health and Wellness Club because we didn't have any resources, and I was like, this is a school with a bunch of like young adults and nerdy ones at that, and we have and coming from all over the world with different levels of sex education. Of course, we need a space where people can speak about these things and learn about these things without shame. And that just sort of carried through. I've always been really invested in that. I also am very invested in like the kink community as well, which is another really very misunderstood community that's also becoming really fashionable in recent years. There's which has sort of upsides and downsides. So the kink community is a community that emerged from queer communities and happened very much underground, even amongst like queer culture. The like kinky people and people who do have alternative sex or alternative intimacy would be buried even further underground because they said, oh, we're just starting to get acceptance from straight people, you're going to ruin everything. Whereas what's actually happening, I think that you see people doing things you don't understand and you think, oh, there's something wrong there. But what's actually happening is this whole culture that's being built around really clear understanding and deep understanding of consent, of communication, of what intimacy really is and means. And I could talk about this for a whole hour, so I won't. But like the point is that there is so much that has been developed for decades by this community that people can use in every other context that we're just not tapping into because of shame. Um, so I taught a workshop, for example, at an art at a like a experimental art school kind of residency space in Iceland. That was a 5-day long workshop using the structure and framework uh, of like a BDSM scene in the BDSM community, and how you can apply that to collaborative art making so that you can have like safer uh, and just like better communication within collaborations that has nothing to do with sex or intimacy or whatever in terms of like that whole alternative worlds, but it's just how can we make art better together, where we can use frameworks of consent, communication, safe words, aftercare, etc. So anyway, I just with that over there, I've always wanted to bridge those worlds, and there are some game makers that do it, but often in like really little indie spaces. I think that when we talk about sex and kink positivity in games, you can talk in the broader sense of how is sex and intimacy portrayed in games in general, like when we play, like when we romance characters in Dragons, or rather Dragon Age, or in Baldur's Gate, or how is sex represented in Grand Theft Auto, or whatever. But we can also talk about these little indie spaces where there are sex positive games happening, but nobody really talks about it because we don't really want to touch that. There's a game maker. I'm just going to double check his first name because I haven't spoken about him in a while. Yeah, okay. So Robert Yang, I'm a huge fan of his, and one day I'm going to send him a cold email and just see if we can talk. He is last I checked, I don't know what he's doing now, but he was a game design professor at NYU. He's also a gay man, and he's made some amazing games, like little games. One of my favorites by him is one called Hurt Me Plenty, which is in itself a reference to like to Doom, but and I think it's Doom only. I don't know, but anyway, so and it's a game where you play as someone who you basically play through the whole structure of a scene where you have you're a person who's going to spank a guy. And so in the beginning, you have a negotiation where you're shaking his hand and he tells you all of his limits. And then you do the scene, and it's very silly because the guy has ragdoll physics. So when you like spank him, he wobbles all over the place. And then afterwards, you have aftercare where you're rubbing his back, and and you talk about how you did. And one of the things in it is if you he gives you a safe word in the beginning, and if you violate the safe word, depending on how many times you violated it or how badly you violated the safe word, at the end of it, the game will lock you out, and he'll say, oh, I don't really want to play with you because that didn't feel safe for me. And you can't play the game for a set amount of time. It will just lock you out of it completely. And I think things like that are really beautiful and underspoken about, that we don't have like it doesn't, like even now there's an element of, me worrying that people listening are all of a sudden like, oh, this has been a nice conversation, but now we're talking about this, you know? And so I think that's a big shame and something I've always wanted to bridge. And it's also one of the things that I feel like I've not done as much because of visa restrictions and worrying about, expanding beyond. So most of my work regarding sex education or kink education has happened parallel to my games career and not really intertwined, even though there's a really right space for that. I don't know if that actually answered your initial question. I get so
Oh,
excited about that stuff that I just kind of go,
it totally answered it. It is, I think it's a general thing too. If something's taboo or if something's not like mainstream, it's sort of like a habit to be like, that doesn't exist.
yeah,
It's not a thing. So
yeah.
yeah, I can understand. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that nowadays, so at the beginning of that ramble, I had mentioned how it's becoming fashionable. I think that you're seeing a little bit more representation of kink communities or kinks in like TV shows and, streaming and stuff like that. Where, or even in like music and mainstream music, you'll see representations of it, but it comes most of like the vast majority of the time it's happening without any actual connection to the community that developed that practice in the first place. So it's worse than tokenization. It's actually an exploitation and a misrepresentation of a really rich and beautiful community. And it's quite dangerous for not just the community itself in terms of, it's a misrepresentation of everything these people have built, but it also means that people will look at it and think, oh, I've been interested in that. That might be what it is. And then they just do it without any of the safeguarding practices that this community has developed and built and end up getting hurt and then end up thinking, oh, this thing actually is bad and evil because I had a really horrible experience through it based on what was available to me. Um, so, yeah. So I think that
Yeah.
people who actually represent the community should have more of a voice, basically, when we're creating games with kinky stuff in it or TV shows with kinky stuff in it or whatever. We should be consulted more for the good of everyone.
Yeah, I agree. It would be nice to get like, some actual like information about this stuff from people who are actually like tied to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same with a lot of things surrounding diversity
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
even marginalized gender. So like all around, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I think those
Um,
things are very connected. Yeah.
yeah. As a closing statement, lastly, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
What advice would you give to marginalized people who are entering the game dev world, or anyone that like we talked about in like groups that fit in, like neurodiversity, even in the kink culture? Like, what advice would you give them?
To anyone entering the game dev world who have similar things to what's going on in me, uh, yeah, I think I think a big piece of advice would be to to not ever think that you have to minimize the person that you are in order to fit into the spaces or in the ways that you think that you have to. I think that um, I think it's important to not compromise yourself for any space. And I also, in saying that, I also recognize how hard that is. That sometimes it may feel easier to just conform. And like this also kind of extends to I my girlfriend is trans. I'm not trans, but so many of my friends are. And this also extends to queer people, trans people, or anybody who is afraid of like a part of yourself being accepted. There is real it can feel extremely dangerous, and sometimes it is dangerous to be honest about who you are. But when you can, I think that the more that you embrace yourself and say it's other people's job to embrace me, not mine to make myself palatable for them, the more that you can do that in the long run, the more power you will have. And power, not in the sense of like, you know, corporate power, money power, whatever, but in terms of your own sense of self, your integrity. So I would say, in short, be yourself, be strong in that, even when it's hard. Um, and I would also say reach out to people who um, and build community. I think community is one of the things that I care about the most. I think that it's the only thing that's allowed me to survive so much in my life has been a sense of community that I've had, which I've found in really unlikely places. So whether that's finding a community that exists or being a part of building one, find or build your community and build like a web of support. Really love and support each other. Um, yeah, I don't know. That's really
I
wordy advice, but
no, I
uh,
think that's a really wonderful last message. Like it's a really great piece of advice to leave everyone with. So I think it's beautiful.
thank you,
um, so this concludes our episode of the Game Dev Local podcast. I want to give a big thank you to you, Hannah. It has
thank
been
you,
a pleasure to speak with you today, and thank you, everyone. We will see you next time.
thank you so much, Nina.